The dust hung thick in the air that morning, swirling around the wooden posts of the livestock pen like ghosts dancing in the early light. The town of Redemption Creek had seen better days, but the monthly auction still drew folks from miles around, ranchers and farmers looking to expand their herds or find a workhorse to ease their burdens. The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning chill, sharp and practiced, calling out numbers that meant the difference between survival and ruin for those who depended on their animals. In the corner of the largest pen stood a draft horse that nobody seemed to want. She was a Belgian mare, her coat the color of wheat fields at harvest time, but her frame carried more weight than what the ranchers considered useful. Her belly hung low, her hindquarters were broad and thick, and when she moved, it was with a heaviness that made the experienced cattlemen shake their heads and turn away. They called her overweight, unfit for the hard work of ranch life, too slow for herding and too cumbersome for the long drives across the open range. The other horses in the pen, sleeker and more refined, drew interested gazes and competitive bids, but the Belgian mare stood alone, her large brown eyes watching the crowd with something that looked almost like resignation. The auctioneer had tried twice to generate interest, his voice losing its enthusiasm each time he gestured toward her. The starting bid dropped lower and lower, from $50 to $30, then to $20, but still no hands rose from the crowd. Some of the men laughed, making jokes about how much feed she would require, how she would probably break a wagon shaft with her weight, how she was better suited for glue than honest work. The mare's ears flickered at the sound of their voices, and she shifted her weight from one leg to another, as if the wooden rails of the pen were the only thing holding her up against the weight of their judgment. Thomas Brennan stood at the back of the crowd, his weathered hands resting on the top rail of the fence, his face shadowed by the wide brim of his hat. He was a man who spoke little and observed much, a quality that had served him well during his 43 years on this earth. His ranch, the Broken Creek Spread, sat 15 miles northwest of town, a modest operation that he ran alone since his wife Margaret had passed 3 winters ago. The loneliness of those years had carved deep lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of sleepless nights and silent meals, of conversations held only with the wind and the cattle. He had come to the auction not looking for anything in particular, just needing a reason to be among people again, to hear voices other than his own. But when his eyes fell on the Belgian mare, something stirred in his chest, something he had not felt in a long time. He saw past the extra weight and the dismissive comments of the other ranchers. He saw the way she held her head, not with defeat but with a quiet dignity that refused to be broken by circumstance. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the way she watched everything around her with careful attention. Most of all, he saw himself in her, overlooked and underestimated, judged by appearances rather than worth. The auctioneer was about to move on, his hand already gesturing toward the next lot, when Thomas raised his hand. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but it stopped the auctioneer mid-sentence. A few heads turned in the crowd, surprised that anyone would bother. Thomas walked forward slowly, his boots leaving prints in the dust, and when he reached the pen, he looked directly at the mare. She looked back at him, and for a moment, it seemed as if they understood each other in a way that needed no words. $20 changed hands, and Thomas led the mare out of the pen with a rope halter, ignoring the amused glances and whispered comments from the other ranchers. One old-timer called out that he would be feeding that horse for months before she could do a day's work, but Thomas did not respond. He simply walked his new horse toward the wagon he had driven into town, his pace unhurried, his manner calm. The mare followed without resistance, her heavy hooves striking the packed earth with a steady rhythm that somehow sounded right to Thomas, like the beat of a heart that had finally found its proper tempo. The journey back to Broken Creek took most of the morning, the wagon creaking along the rutted road that wound through the grasslands and over the low hills that marked the boundary of Thomas's property. He had not named the mare yet, preferring to wait until he knew her better, until he understood what name would fit her spirit. She walked behind the wagon tied to the back rail, her pace steady despite her size, her breathing even and strong. When they stopped at a creek to let the horses drink, Thomas noticed how carefully she moved down the bank, how she tested each step before committing her weight, a sign of intelligence and caution that many lighter horses lacked. The Broken Creek Ranch was not grand by any measure, but it was honest and well kept. The house was a simple structure of wood and stone, the barns sturdy enough to withstand the harsh winters, the corrals built with care and maintained with regular attention. Thomas had let some things go since Margaret died, the flower garden she had loved now overgrown with weeds, the porch she had swept every morning now dusty and neglected, but the essential work of the ranch continued. He ran a small herd of cattle, about 60 head, and kept a few chickens and a milk cow. It was enough to sustain him, enough to give his days purpose, but not enough to fill the silence that had settled over the place like a heavy blanket. That he led the mare into the barn and gave her a stall that had stood empty for 2 years, since his old plow horse had died of age and exhaustion. The stall was spacious and clean, with fresh straw that Thomas spread carefully across the floor. He filled the water trough and measured out a portion of hay, not too much despite her size, understanding that her weight likely came from poor-quality feed eaten out of desperation rather than overindulgence. The mare moved into the stall cautiously, sniffing the corners and testing the space before lowering her head to the hay. Thomas stood watching her for a long time, his arms crossed over his chest, his mind working through the weeks and months ahead. The other ranchers had been wrong about many things, but they had been right about one thing: the mare would need time before she could do the kind of work Thomas needed. She was out of condition, her muscles hidden beneath layers of fat, her wind short from lack of proper exercise. But Thomas was a patient man, and patience was something he had in abundance. He began her training slowly, not with hard labor but with long walks across the ranch, familiarizing her with the land and letting her body adjust to regular, purposeful movement. Every morning after breakfast, he would halter her and lead her along the fence lines, checking posts and wire while she walked beside him, her breathing gradually becoming easier, her steps becoming lighter. In the evenings, he would brush her coat, working the tangles from her mane and tail, talking to her in a low voice about nothing and everything. He told her about Margaret, about how she had loved horses and had convinced him to buy his first mare 30 years ago, how she had taught him that animals had souls just as complex as people, that they felt joy and sorrow, hope and despair. He told the mare about the loneliness that had become his constant companion, about the weight of silence in a house that once rang with laughter, about the struggle to find meaning in days that all seemed the same. The mare would stand quietly during these sessions, her eyes half closed, her ears turned toward his voice as if she understood every word. Weeks passed, and then months, and the transformation was remarkable. The mare's body began to change as the fat melted away, revealing the powerful muscles of her breed, the strong shoulders and deep chest that made Belgians the finest draft horses in the world. Her coat took on a shine that caught the sunlight like polished copper, and her movements became fluid and purposeful. Thomas started her on light work, pulling a small cart loaded with fence posts, then graduating to the plow for the kitchen garden he had decided to resurrect. She took to the work naturally, her intelligence showing in the way she learned commands quickly and remembered them perfectly, her strength evident in the way she moved heavy loads without strain. But it was not just the mare that was changing. Thomas found himself waking earlier, eager to start the day's work with her, planning projects that had seemed too daunting when he faced them alone. He repaired the chicken coop that had been falling apart, rebuilt the gate to the south pasture, even started clearing Margaret's flower garden with the mare pulling a small plow to turn the soil. The physical labor felt good, purposeful, and the mare's presence somehow made the silence less oppressive. When he talked to her now, it did not feel like the desperate rambling of a lonely man but like genuine conversation between partners. The summer brought challenges that tested them both. A severe drought dried up the creek that gave the ranch its name, forcing Thomas to haul water from a spring 3 miles distant. The mare pulled the water wagon day after day, the load heavy and the road rough, but she never faltered or complained. During a violent thunderstorm, lightning struck the barn, starting a small fire that threatened to spread. Thomas worked frantically to extinguish the flames while the other animals panicked and fled, but the mare stood calm in her stall, her steady presence somehow reassuring him that they would survive this together. When the fire was out and the danger passed, he found himself standing in her stall with his arms around her neck, his face pressed against her warm coat, feeling the beat of her heart and realizing that she had become more than just a workhorse. She had become a friend, a companion, a reminder that life could still hold purpose and connection, the turning point came on a cold October morning when Thomas heard shouting from the direction of his neighbor's property. Jacob Morrison ran a much larger operation than Thomas, with hundreds of cattle and half a dozen hired hands, and the two men had never been particularly close. Morrison was the kind of rancher who measured worth in dollars and judged men by the size of their herds, and he had made no secret of his amusement when he heard Thomas had bought the fat mare that nobody wanted. But on this morning, Morrison came riding hard onto Thomas's land, his face pale with worry, asking for help. A section of Morrison's herd had broken through a fence during the night and scattered into the rough country to the north, dangerous terrain full of ravines and dense brush where cattle could easily become trapped or injured. Morrison's horses were all out on a cattle drive with most of his hands, and he did not have enough men or mounts to gather the strays before nightfall. He needed help, and despite their lack of friendship, Thomas did not hesitate. This was the code of the frontier: when a neighbor needed help, you helped, regardless of personal feelings. Thomas saddled the mare, something he had been working toward for months but had not yet fully tested, and rode out with Morrison and his two remaining hands. The rough country lived up to its reputation, full of steep slopes and hidden gullies, thick stands of juniper and sharp rocks that could lame a horse in seconds. Morrison's men rode their lean cow ponies, quick and agile but beginning to tire as the day wore on, while Thomas and the mare moved through the terrain with steady determination. Her size, which the ranchers at the auction had mocked, became an advantage in the heavy brush, her powerful body pushing through obstacles that smaller horses had to navigate around. Her weight, once seen as a burden, gave her stability on the treacherous slopes where lighter horses struggled for footing. They found cattle scattered across miles of badlands, some trapped in ravines, others cut off by fallen timber or dense thickets. The mare worked with a focus and intelligence that amazed even Thomas, responding to his cues instantly, using her body to turn stubborn steers, her calm demeanor settling nervous cows. When they found a young heifer trapped in a narrow gully with a broken leg, it was the mare who stood steady while Thomas fashioned a travois, and they dragged the injured animal back to level ground where Morrison could arrange for its care. The work continued for 12 hours straight, and by the time the sun was setting, they had gathered nearly all the strayed cattle and pushed them back through the repaired fence onto Morrison's land. Morrison sat on his horse at the fence line, his eyes moving between his recovered cattle and Thomas's mare, and for the first time since Thomas had known him, the man seemed at a loss for words. Finally, he cleared his throat and said that he had been wrong, that he had judged too quickly at the auction, that the mare was clearly one of the finest working horses he had ever seen. He offered to buy her on the spot, naming a price that was 10 times what Thomas had paid, enough money to make a real difference to a small rancher. Thomas sat quietly on the mare's back, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing beneath him, remembering the day he had first seen her standing alone in that pen, overlooked and unwanted. He thought about the months they had spent together, the gradual transformation they had both undergone, the way she had filled the empty spaces in his life without him even realizing it was happening. He looked at Morrison and shook his head slowly, his voice firm but not unkind. She was not for sale, he said. She was home. The ride back to Broken Creek in the darkness felt different than any ride Thomas could remember. The mare knew the way, and he trusted her to find it, so he let the reins rest loose in his hands and simply sat, looking up at the stars that filled the sky from horizon to horizon. He thought about Margaret and how she would have loved this horse, how she would have been proud of him for seeing value where others saw only inadequacy. He thought about the lessons the mare had taught him, about patience and persistence, about how transformation took time and care, about how worth was not determined by appearance or by the judgments of those who did not take the time to look deeper. When they reached the ranch, he unsaddled the mare and brushed her down carefully, checking her legs and hooves for any signs of injury from the long day's work. She was tired but sound, her eyes still bright, her spirit undiminished. He gave her extra grain as a reward and stood in the stall doorway for a long time, watching her eat, feeling a contentment he had not known in years. Tomorrow he would start work on Margaret's garden again, he decided. He would plant the flowers she had loved, roses and daisies and the tall purple stalks of lupin that grew wild on the hills. He would do it because she would have wanted it, but also because he wanted it, because he had learned that it was possible to honor the past while still living in the present, to carry grief without being crushed by it. winter came hard that year, with snow that piled high against the barn walls and temperatures that dropped so low the water froze in the troughs within minutes of being poured. But the ranch was ready, the repairs completed, the hay stored, the animals sheltered and comfortable. Thomas and the mare worked together through the short days, breaking ice on the stock pond, hauling feed to the cattle scattered across the winter pastures, keeping the ranch running despite the brutal weather. On the coldest nights, Thomas would sometimes stand in the barn doorway after finishing his chores, looking out at the snow-covered land and feeling a peace that surprised him with its depth and steadiness. Word of the mare spread through the county, carried by Morrison's grudging praise and by the testimony of those who had seen her work. Other ranchers stopped by the Broken Creek Ranch, some openly curious, others making offers to buy or breed their mares to produce foals with her quality. Thomas turned them all away politely, but he did not mind the visitors. The ranch felt less isolated now, less like a place of exile and more like a home. He even hosted a small gathering at Christmas, neighbors he had avoided for years, and felt Margaret's presence in the warm laughter and good conversation that filled the house. Spring arrived with its usual drama of thunderstorms and greening grass, and Thomas hitched the mare to the plow and broke ground for a much larger garden than he had originally planned. He planted vegetables in neat rows, and along the fence line, he planted Margaret's flowers from seeds he had saved. The mare pulled the plow with easy strength, the earth turning dark and rich behind them, and Thomas felt something he had not felt in 3 years. He felt hope, not the desperate kind that clings to wishes and dreams, but the solid kind built on work and partnership and the knowledge that tomorrow would come and he would face it with strength. The mare he finally named Grace, because that was what she had brought into his life when he needed it most. Grace unearned and unexpected, grace that transformed not through dramatic miracles but through the quiet, persistent work of days turned into weeks turned into seasons. She had not saved his life in any heroic sense, had not pulled him from a burning building or carried him to safety through a storm. Instead, she had done something more subtle and perhaps more important. She had given him a reason to save himself, to rebuild what had been broken, to remember that he still had value and purpose. Years passed, and the Broken Creek Ranch prospered in its modest way. Thomas expanded his herd, improved his land, became known throughout the county as a man of integrity and skill. Grace worked beside him through all of it, her strength seemingly endless, her intelligence constantly surprising him with new displays of understanding and adaptation. They became a familiar sight on the roads around Redemption Creek, the quiet cowboy and his golden mare, moving through their work with the kind of partnership that comes only from mutual respect and genuine affection. Sometimes, on summer evenings, Thomas would stand at the fence and watch Grace grazing in the pasture, her coat glowing in the setting sun, and he would remember that day at the auction when nobody wanted her. He would think about all the people who had judged her by appearance, who had seen only problems and burdens, who had laughed and walked away. And he would smile, because they had been wrong in ways they would never understand. They had missed the chance to know a truly exceptional creature, a horse who possessed not just physical strength but strength of character, not just the ability to work but the willingness to give everything to those who earned her trust. The story of Grace and Thomas became something of a legend in that part of the country, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy around campfires and in saloons. Some versions made it a tale of redemption, others a love story between a lonely man and his horse, still others a lesson about seeing beyond surfaces to the truth beneath. But for Thomas, it was simpler than any of those interpretations. It was just his life, the second act that he had not known he would get, the gift of companionship when he had resigned himself to solitude. On a warm afternoon 10 years after that auction, Thomas sat on the porch of his house, older now but still strong, watching Grace roll in the dust of the corral like a young filly. The garden bloomed with Margaret's flowers, the ranch ran smoothly, and the loneliness that had once threatened to consume him had faded to a distant memory. He had learned that transformation was possible at any age, that being overlooked or underestimated was not the same as being without worth, that the best things in life often came in unexpected packages that others were too blind or too arrogant to value. Grace finished her roll and stood, shaking the dust from her coat in a cloud of gold, and looked toward the porch where Thomas sat. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that look was everything they had built together, all the miles they had traveled, all the work they had done, all the quiet moments of understanding that had bound their lives into a single story. Thomas raised his hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement, and Grace lowered her head and returned to grazing, content in the knowledge that she was home, valued, and loved. The sun moved lower in the sky, painting the grasslands in shades of amber and rose, and Thomas thought about the young man he had been, about Margaret and the life they had shared, about the dark years after her death, and about the unexpected grace that had carried him through. He thought about all the choices he had made, good and bad, and about the one choice he would never regret, raising his hand at that auction, seeing what others could not see, taking a chance on a horse that nobody wanted. It had cost him $20 and changed his life in ways that money could never measure, teaching him that sometimes the things we rescue end up rescuing us, that worth is not determined by the crowd's opinion, and that the greatest treasures are often the ones that everyone else walks past without a second glance.